Welcome to Falkirk, one of Scotland's most historic towns, home to a range of captivating sites nestled among a bustling town centre. With the best part of 2,000 years of history, Falkirk is full of heritage, with everything from Roman history to two great battles, and even the original home of Irn-Bru. We'll talk about all that and more on our walk around Falkirk, but we begin at the heart of town, down beside the towering Falkirk Steeple. Built in 1814, this icon of Falkirk has stood here on the town's old marketplace for over 200 years, serving as the centre not just of local commerce, but of fairs and events in Falkirk, and even some of the more gruesome stories to come out of the town. However, this wasn't the first steeple to have stood on the site. The current steeple, which stands 141 feet or 34 metres high today, is the third structure to have been built here on the marketplace as a central point in Falkirk. When it was built, the steeple housed Falkirk's small jail, the old cells of which can still be seen inside the building today. However, the most notable moment in its 200-plus year history is marked here down on the ground, when the soaring steeple spire was hit by lightning in 1927. During a violent summer storm, a bolt of lightning destroyed the top of the building, and debris that fell down onto the marketplace here injured a number of people, and sadly killed a horse nearby too. At the foot of the steeple, meanwhile, we can see the site of the old town well, marked by these cobbles. But this site was also where many public punishments, such as floggings and hangings, took place. But one particularly gruesome tale here was that people found to have defamed others were punished by having their ear nailed to the wall of the steeple. The punishment then was either to wait a few days to be released, or if you were brave enough, you could yank yourself free by tearing your ear off. Just across the marketplace here is the newer town well, built in 1817, a few feet from where the original well stood. With the local water supply and the Mercat Cross located here, this point was very much the centre of life in Falkirk for centuries, and although many of its historic structures are now gone, their traces give us a window into the long history of this town. But as we now make our way away from the marketplace, let's have a look at exactly where in Scotland Falkirk is located. As you can see from this map, Falkirk lies in the middle of Scotland's densely populated central belt, located roughly 20 miles away from both Glasgow and Edinburgh. The town's central location has meant it has been a part of many major points in Scottish history, once located on the Roman Antonine Wall, the northernmost reach of their enormous empire, and even having been the site of the defeat of Braveheart himself, William Wallace, in 1298. But away from the wider narrative of Scottish history, Falkirk has an especially varied local history, and it all began roughly from this point in the modern town. At some point in the 7th century AD, a small church possibly made of speckled stone was built here. That original church gave the name to the settlement of Falkirk, then known in Gaelic as Egglesbrech, meaning the speckled church. Later on in history, the name Egglesbrech was translated into Scots as Falkirk, ultimately evolving into the name Falkirk, which we have today. The large church that stands before us here occupies the site of that original Falkirk, which has been perhaps the most important site in town for over 1,000 years. The current church dates mostly from 1811, although the tower and steeple at the top of the building are slightly older, having been built back in 1738. The church sits right at the centre of modern Falkirk in this once cluttered graveyard. But in the 1960s, the churchyard was largely cleared, leaving just a few historic tombs to be seen around the church. The most famous of those is undoubtedly the resting place of Sir John de Graeme, the right-hand man of William Wallace, and who died fighting in the Battle of Falkirk in 1298. One of the leading Scottish nobles who fought against the English during the Wars of Scottish Independence in the 13th century, Graeme was a much-loved figure in Scotland, and after his death in the battle, which took place to the south of the modern town, he was carried into Falkirk and buried here. much later on in the 18th century, his tomb here was surrounded by this ornate iron enclosure. John de Graeme was one of 3 commanders of Scotland's armies that died at Falkirk, as the English took a significant victory over the Scots. A decisive moment in the conflict, the battle came just under a year after William Wallace, then Guardian of Scotland, had led the Scots to a heroic David versus Goliath victory over the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. However, at Falkirk, the Scottish army was both outnumbered and at a technological disadvantage, and the English annihilated the Scots, including a number of its commanders, like John de Graeme. While the English armies ultimately retreated south of the border after their victory, the Scots' defeat proved particularly devastating for William Wallace, whose reputation as a tactically astute military leader was ruined. In the aftermath of the battle, Wallace fled into the woods outside Falkirk, and a few months later resigned his position as Guardian of Scotland, to be succeeded by another national hero, Robert the Bruce. Now, having made our way out of the churchyard, the Battle of Falkirk in 1298 wasn't the last time that this town would see a significant conflict, as the later Battle of Falkirk Muir would come over 400 years later during the Jacobite rebellions, and which saw a reverse result of rebels defeating the forces of the British government. After all that talk of battles and conflict, we now find ourselves walking onto Lint Riggs, once upon a time a medieval lane that was so narrow you could only fit 1 horse through it at a time. The street was significantly widened in 1903, but its name gives a hint back to a time when agriculture was the dominant force in Falkirk. Lint Riggs is a Scots name meaning fields of flax, referring to the crop popularly used to make linen. Back in the 18th century, linen was used widely in clothing in this part of Scotland, in contrast to wool in other parts of Great Britain. It's thought, however, that there wasn't much linen production in Falkirk at the time, but the town was still regarded as one of southern Scotland's most important market towns. As we now walk out onto the High Street, which descends down this fairly gentle gradient from the marketplace where we started out, markets in Falkirk were the beginning of the town's reputation as an important regional centre. In the year 1600, Falkirk was granted the rights to hold markets by King James VI. Initially, Falkirk rose as a centre for the trade of cattle, with its cattle market once one of the largest in Scotland, attracting farmers from across the country, and even some from northern England too. However, by the turn of the 19th century, Falkirk began to develop into a hub of heavy industry and manufacturing, most notably a home of iron production, with a number of foundries set up all around the town. The export of iron from Falkirk to a wider market was facilitated by the building of canals that linked the town to Edinburgh and Glasgow, and so iron remained at the centre of Falkirk's economy into the 20th century, at which point the industry began to gradually decline. Iron remains an important part of Falkirk's heritage today though, and it even made its way into the name of one of the town's most famous exports, Irn-Bru, otherwise known as Scotland's other national drink. Falkirk's original Irn-Bru factory was located just a few streets from here, but you might know that Falkirk isn't the only place which claims to be the home of Irn-Bru, a debate which we'll talk about after we take a look at these buildings over the road. Across the road here we can see the former Sheriff Courthouse of Falkirk, opened in 1868. Originally, the local courts were located in a number of temporarily used buildings around the town centre, but the building of this rather elegant new courthouse was another symbol of Falkirk cementing itself as a town of real significance by the latter 19th century. The latter 19th century is also when Irn-Bru is said to have been born, so let's get into the story of its creation. If you drink a can of Barr's Irn-Bru today, you'll often see the date 1901 written on it, but records show that the drink was actually being made and popularly sold long beforehand. In 1875, Robert Barr began producing soft drinks just down the road here in Falkirk, originally selling it under the name Strachensbrew. In 1887, Barr's son set up his own soft drinks business in nearby Glasgow, producing his drinks under the name Gingerade. The sale of both drinks was hugely popular in both Falkirk and Glasgow, and by 1900 their production had grown to a substantial size. The following year, 1901, was when the Glasgow and Falkirk factories merged production, beginning the production of the drink they named Irn-Bru. By that account, it's fair to say that Falkirk was the original birthplace of Irn-Bru, although Glasgow, which also claims the drink to a degree, had a big part in its development. We've now made our way around to the northern side of the town centre, where we're standing before the town's Boer War Memorial, dedicated to the soldiers of the Eastern Division of Stirlingshire, who fell in the War of 1899 to 1902. The memorial stands on a square in front of the old Burgh Buildings, built in 1879, and which gave Falkirk's newly established town council an official home, after they had spent about 40 years meeting in rooms linked to the town steeple. As such, the Burgh Buildings became the heart of local government in Falkirk, until the council eventually moved out in the 1960s to larger premises on the edge of the town centre. While the Burgh Buildings served as the home of local government in Falkirk, just across the road once stood the cultural heart of the town, the Old Town Hall. Shown in this picture, taken from roughly where we're standing, the Old Town Hall was a majestic Falkirk landmark, much loved by the townspeople, as the place where concerts, balls, and all manner of other local events were held. Originally built in 1879, the town hall was demolished in the 1960s, after a new one was opened elsewhere. But if you look to the right of your picture, you'll see a wall that once belonged to the Old Town Hall, the last remains of the historic Falkirk building. The site of the Old Town Hall has remained unused since its demolition in the late 60s, after initial plans to build halls for the old parish church on the site actually caused damage to the historic church. Just next door, meanwhile, we find ourselves looking up at another of central Falkirk's most important churches, St Andrew's West, which was built in 1896 with eye-catching red stones. Like the old parish church, St Andrew's West here is part of the Church of Scotland, and remains a busy place for worship to this day. The church overlooks Newmarket Street here, which is today home to this statue of the Duke of Wellington, former Prime Minister and Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, and his horse. When it was erected in 1854, however, this statue actually stood on the marketplace at the foot of the steeple, but it was vandalised on Hogmanay in 1904, and so was swiftly moved away to this street the following year. Newmarket Street today marks the northern side of the very heart of Falkirk, and as well as having been home to many public buildings, it was also the site of Aitken's Brewery, a family brewery established in 1740, and which operated just a bit further back along the street for over 200 years. Aitken's Brewery, which produced ales that were exported worldwide, once featured a grand chimney that towered over the town centre, although it was demolished in the 1970s, a couple of years after the brewery ceased operations for the last time. Without the old chimney, which you can see in this old photo of Falkirk, the town's skyline looks rather different, but Falkirk today is still well known in Scotland as the home of some spectacular modern monuments outside the town centre. Perhaps the most famous of those is this, the Kelpies, an enormous sculpture of two horse heads opened in 2014 by the nearby Forth and Clyde Canal. Standing 98 feet or 30 metres high, the Kelpies are the largest public artwork in Scotland, and represent the mythical beings known as Kelpies, sea creatures that had the form of horses, but were able to transform themselves into human form too. The Kelpies are just a 10-minute drive from the centre of town here, and a highlight of any visit to Falkirk. Back here in the town centre, meanwhile, we're passing by Falkirk's old grammar school, opened in 1846, and which replaced an older, overcrowded local school a few streets away. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, the rise of heavy industry in Falkirk saw the town's population skyrocket during the Industrial Revolution. In 1755, Falkirk was home to just under 4,000 people, but in 1911, after the development of all that industry, there were over 35,000 people living in the area. Today, the wider area of Falkirk Council is home to as many as 160,000 people, while the town here, the largest settlement in the council area, has a population of around 35,000. We've now made our way around the edge of the town centre, and here on Bank Street we find the Carron Works Pub, named after the first ironworks that opened in the town back in the year 1759. The building itself, meanwhile, was once the Bank Street Picture House, a local cinema that was originally built as a church, but converted into a movie theatre in 1920, screening many classics of cinema until its closure in 1972. This road, Bank Street, which takes its name from the old Falkirk Union Bank that stood on it in the early 19th century, is one of the oldest in modern-day Falkirk, as the town was once laid out in a very different way, with a number of tiny alleyways that linked the High Street and other main roads together. One example of those old alleyways was Lint Riggs, which we mentioned earlier was once so narrow that you could only fit one horse through it at a time. In a little while, we'll take a walk down one of the last remaining medieval alleyways, or courts, as they're known in Falkirk, which will give us an idea of what walking around old Falkirk was once like. We've now made our way onto another of Falkirk's oldest roads, Manor Street, which was originally known as Back Row, so named as it was the second most important thoroughfare through the town centre. Some do say, however, that Manor Street was originally the main road in town, although today it's a little less busy, but links up nicely with some of Falkirk's most historic lanes. Around this corner we find Boer Street, a narrow lane whose name simply means Weaver Street, suggesting that it was once the place where many local weavers worked. However, the street was once also lined with workshops that produced goods linked to the town's nearby flesh market, with workshops for glue, leather and more, all churning out their produce, and a few rather unpleasant smells that pervaded through this now rather more pleasant lane. As the bells ring out from atop the town steeple, Boer Street is today one of Falkirk's most atmospheric spots, and sits at the heart of a part of town which was historically packed to the brim with industry and trade, despite being one of the more claustrophobic parts of the town. Down by the steeple, this part of Falkirk claims to hold a diminutive national record, with this plaque marking Tolbooth Street, which at 58 feet long, claims to be the UK's shortest street. The claim, however, sadly isn't accurate, as the shortest street in the country, and indeed the world, is the 6-foot-long Ebenezer Place, located much further north in the town of Wick. But it's still worth visiting Tolbooth Street here in Falkirk, as it's home to the Tolbooth Tavern, formerly the Gaff Inn, which is said to be the oldest pub in town, and which once served an interesting purpose for inmates of the town jail, who were held in the steeple just beside. The story goes that customers in the tavern would hoist beer up on a pulley system to the men who were being held in the steeple's upper jail. This meant the inmates often spent a lot of their time inside absolutely plastered, possibly to the bemusement, or more likely amusement, of their guards. Standing beneath the town steeple once again, we've now made our way around the heart of Falkirk's town centre. But as we look around the marketplace once again, there's still more to see in this fascinating town. Now heading east down the High Street, we'll walk towards one of Falkirk's historic courts, before we make our way towards the site of an old Roman fort. And then we'll tour a couple more interesting sites on the edge of the town centre, from an unusual church building to the place where Robert Burns once stayed in Falkirk. Here we're passing by the point where Boer Street leads onto the High Street, and where many of those products made on Boer Street made their way out into the town's markets. Opposite it, meanwhile, is the entry to King's Court, one of the best preserved examples of a medieval court, the name for the many historic alleyways that once snaked around Falkirk. Just as Edinburgh is known for the many closes that spurt off the Royal Mile, Falkirk was once full of courts just like this, many taking their name from the courtyards that were related to the buildings that once stood along them. King's Court here, for example, takes its name from the old King's Arms Pub, which stood here in the 19th century, and although now it's gone, this part of town, which has been recently refurbished, is now the home of a number of modern-day taverns and independent cafes and restaurants. King's Court remains the best place in town to get an idea of the narrow world that was historic Falkirk, because by the time of the Industrial Revolution and then the 20th century, the town was dramatically reshaped, with wider streets built for those coming into Falkirk to shop, and larger roads around the town centre for cars driving through Falkirk. Now, having walked through the narrow King's Court, we're into a rather quiet area of the town centre, known to many as Pleasance. But while Pleasance is a fairly calm area today, it was once a place of real significance in the past, as the home of a Roman fort that was built nearly 1900 years ago. Since the 18th century, there had been suspicions among local historians that Falkirk held treasures of the Roman era, as the town was known to have existed on the line of the Antonine Wall, the northernmost defensive wall built by the Romans in Great Britain. Running across what is today Scotland's central belt, the Antonine Wall was built from around AD 142, about 20 years after Hadrian's Wall, about 100 miles to the south of here, was built across northern England. When it was built under the orders of the Emperor Antoninus Pius, who gave his name to the wall, the Antonine Wall marked the northernmost edge of the Roman Empire, some 1,200 miles away from Rome itself. Along the Antonine Wall were a series of defensive forts, and in the 1990s, the remains of one located in Falkirk were discovered at this point, which is now marked by a wonderful stone monument. The stone monument is inspired by one of the many Roman distant slabs that stood along the 39-mile Antonine Wall, albeit incorporating figures that represent both the Romans and the native Celtic peoples of the region known to the Romans as Caledonia. Famously, the Romans never managed to occupy all of modern-day Scotland, and in AD 162, just 8 years after the Antonine Wall was completed, they withdrew south to Hadrian's Wall. Around the outside of central Falkirk, you'll also find some more remains of the Antonine Wall and the local Roman presence. But just a short walk from the site of the old fort, we find one of the more peculiar buildings in town, known as the Tattie Kirk. Built in 1806, this church was the place of worship for a group of people known as the Anti-Burghers, a splinter group that opposed an oath required to take office in town. You'll notice that the church here is built in an octagonal shape, an unusual form in Scotland, but which was said to be designed so that there was no place for the devil to hide in. The Tattie Kirk was used for worship between 1806 and 1879, later being used as a workshop and a retail space. Now walking out of the old churchyard, which is said to have once been the site of a potato field, where the Tattie Kirk may get its name from, we'll now make our way back onto the High Street along Kirk Wynd, another street name which gives us a clue to Falkirk's history. Long after the old Roman fort was buried by new houses in this part of town, Falkirk became renowned as one of the busiest cattle markets in Scotland. As such, many locals owned cattle, but the cows, of course, couldn't graze in the middle of busy Falkirk. So, those who owned cattle would bring them to Kirk Wynd here, where the town herdsman would then drive the cows out to the common lands that surrounded Falkirk. While Falkirk now sits right in the middle of the most densely populated part of Scotland, it's still surrounded by some lovely countryside, dotted with interesting sights like the Kelpies, which we mentioned earlier, and another famous landmark of Falkirk. To the west of the town centre, you'll find this, the Falkirk Wheel, a spectacular and unique boat lift, which opened in 2002 to reconnect the Forth and Clyde Canal with the neighbouring Union Canal. Another groundbreaking piece of engineering in the Falkirk area, the wheel is the only rotating boat lift in the world, serving as a striking and modern take on the traditional canal lock system, transporting boats between two waterways. As we spoke about earlier, the canals around Falkirk were instrumental in its industrial development a couple of centuries ago, but after falling into disuse in the second half of the 20th century, they've been revitalised as great visitor spots outside the busy urban areas of the Central Belt. Once again now, we're on to Falkirk High Street, and we'll now take a walk down towards the eastern end of the main road, which is where we'll end our tour around Falkirk in a couple of minutes' time. At this point I must give my thanks to some of the wonderful people who helped me out on my visit to Falkirk. Thank you to Janice and all the team at Falkirk Delivers for a fantastic insight into the history of this riveting town, and also for a look inside the old rooms of the Falkirk Steeple, which you'll also be able to see in a video on the channel coming up soon. If you do visit Falkirk for yourself, do take a look at the town's brilliant heritage trail, which inspired the route for the walk we've taken in this video. It's full of riveting hidden gems that an outsider like myself certainly wouldn't have caught at first glance. For example, the heritage trail marks the Callendar Square shopping centre here as the site of the old street of Silver Row, a famous old lane that was once home to a local school and the Grand Roxy Theatre. The shopping centre that now occupies the site of Silver Row was opened in 1993, opposite a part of the High Street that was also full of shops and pubs. Opposite Callendar Square, we find a building that proudly represents the bust of a famous visitor, Robert Burns, the national poet of Scotland, who stopped for the night in 1787 at the old Cross Keys pub, which once occupied this site. Burns stopped here in Falkirk on the first night of his tour of the Highlands, and took in many of the sights of the town that we've seen today as well, before journeying north deeper into Scotland. The old Cross Keys pub where he stayed was in operation until the 1960s, and it was one of countless taverns that stood along the High Street back in the day, almost none of which remain today. Of course, the High Street wasn't always pedestrianised like it is today, many of its pubs serving as coaching inns for travellers passing through Falkirk to stop off and have a meal and a drink. Centrally located, many people pass through this town when travelling in almost any direction through Scotland, but the building of motorways like the M8, M9 and M80 around Falkirk mean that it's no longer the busy passing point it once was. As symbolised by the modern Callendar Square shopping centre that occupies much of the eastern part of the town centre, Falkirk today is a very different place to what it was even 60 years ago. Still, the hallmarks of its history can be seen all over town, and here at the end of the High Street we see the Callendar Arms, named after the Grand Callendar House and Park, a 600-year-old residence that sits just outside the town and roughly on the line of the Antonine Wall. with spectacular landmarks from the Kelpies to the Falkirk Wheel and more to be found outside the town, and a treasure trove of riveting stories, old landmarks, and the birthplace of none other than Irn-Bru. Falkirk is a fascinating place to explore, as I hope you'll agree from this walk. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting Falkirk for yourself sometime soon.